let me just use these couple of seconds I have to really thank the organizers, Oliver Olvache, Annie, and Arth for setting this up, and specifically for their persistence and steadfastness in actually implementing this as a real-life conference, not as a Zoom conference. And let me also kind of like make a small disclaimer. I'm basically, this is a larger project that incorporates two cities, that is that of Bishkek and Yerevan. I have completed all my fieldwork in Bishkek. The fieldwork in Yerevan is still ahead, so I'm actually exactly in the middle of my research. That means, in other words, you will get now a lot of conceptual and theoretical ideas, but no empirical material yet. And I'm really happy to discuss with you also maybe the ideas in which direction I could take my fieldwork, which I hope to implement next spring in Yerevan. Okay, so here we go. If the city formed the face of the socialist project in the Soviet self-image, urban space also reflected its decline in the early 1990s. The paradigm of the post-Soviet suggests here a break, a shift from the old communist to the new neoliberal system of values. Yet the reality in many successive states of the USSR is characterized in many places by continuities that have now outlasted the end of the Soviet experiment by more than 30 years. Stephen Coller's concept of the post-Soviet social here very aptly describes the tension between the material continuity of socialist infrastructure and the efforts to transform urban space in the sense of a neoliberal economic policy. Elite housing and shopping centers, fast food chains, and hip cafes for digital nomads testify to this new economic reality. Yet behind the facade, and of course there is a but, of free market and prosperity, urban space finds itself at the nexus of what Saskia Sassen calls new geographies of marginality, in which the interests of new and old residents, international economic investors, and state actors are pitted against each other in a grueling conflict. See? One more. Just 2 weeks ago in the so-called Central Asian island of democracy, that is Kyrgyzstan, I had visited together with local environmental activists a place called Altan Kasik, which has the wonderful euphemistic name, the Golden Anchor, an informal settlement, Samasakhvat in Russian, at the fringes of Bishkek, which you can see once you shift the perspective, is literally built next to the city's garbage dump, which had enveloped the entire surrounding area in a dark, toxic smoke, which you can see here relatively well. Reminiscent of Michel Foucault's heterotopia, these sites, that slums, spaces of segregation, invisible to most other city residents, constitute the dark side of a post-socialist or better new capitalist urbanity. And the cultural anthropologist Susan Fehlings, in what is to this day one of the few and full monographs devoted to Yerevan as a city, Yerevan, urbanes Chaos und soziale Ordnung, urban chaos and social order, portrays post-socialist Yerevan likewise as a playground for international investors at the example of residents fighting against the demolition of their private homes during the construction of the mega project Northern Avenue, Saint Poroda. According to Felix, protests would ultimately fail as the aggrieved parties proved unable to employ a wider societal Hasrakan perspective beyond the protection of individual, that is Sepakan self-interest. And in the twilight of this transition process, so-called transition process, deadlocked in its own impossibility, so-called post-socialist cities manifest themselves in a contested space of history politics, Geschichtspolitik, in which the past future-cape of the socialist project and the present past-scape of ethno-nationalism appear as antagonistic maps of meaning. What am I interested here? I'm interested here to grasp socialist materiality as fragments of what I call relicts of a communopolitan horizon. This approach holds that they embody the apparent contradiction of being at the same time remnant of a past, that is a relic, and significant of an unfulfilled and ultimately abandoned future horizon. Turning to socialist imaginations of a city of the future is in this context a special case in which the historical image, das Geschichtsbild, is at the same time an image of the future encapsulated in the past. So similar to the work of Afrotopia, but for instance by the social scientist Fevin Sarbai from Senegal, the focus of my work lies here equally in exploring the relationship between utopias of the past and the present in an age of disillusionment described by scholars such as Frederick Jameson as, I quote, a non-utopian present without historicity and futurity. Or It is the everyday life experience under neoliberal capitalism today with its own antagonisms and contradictions that forges the temporally conditioned realm of experience in which residents of today may engage with, appraise, or discard the materiality of the socialist past. So viewed from the perspective of today's system, materialization of the socialist city appear in retrospect, to borrow the wording from the famous postmodern writer Thomas Pynchon, like, I quote, lost crystallizations of all the present city had denied. So in my own project, the current project aims to rethink the socialist future city, that is Gor Budushiva, so to speak, from the geographical south. That is, I go to the cities of Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan and Yerevan in, as we all know, present-day Armenia. And I'm really interested in, like, what is the specific urban trajectory of post-Stalinist, specifically urbanization in this context of both cities, and what is the afterlife, so the life and the afterlife of the socialist city in both sides today. I can talk a bit about the complemented research. However, I'll try to keep that relatively brief, since that all applies to the city of Bishkek. And then I will straight on move further to discuss with you more what I have in mind for Yerevan next year. So this is basically a kind of overview of the envisaged, which might come out as a second book project. So the first one is that of building the international city from below. It is an already complemented research in which I explored the role of an industrial commune of Czechoslovak Esperanto speakers from the town of Žilina, and which played a crucial role in the forging of urbanity in early Soviet Bishkek, and also in the fostering of cultural life in the new capital of the Kyrgyz SSR. Based on this, the chapter moves from the utopia of an urbanization from below to the idea of the 15-minute city that is like the utopia of the polycentric city. And it takes a fresh look at the microrayon, the micro-district, by fostering a critical dialogue between today's vision of building the 15-minute city, something that some urban studies researchers might be familiar with regard to the ambitious plan in Paris, but also in context of China. And I look at this as a kind of way of revisiting the socialist project of micro-rionization, which continues to inform urban life from East Berlin and Vladivostok to Kabul and Cuba. I here in specifically case looked at the case of Bishkek. That is a prose article which I have just finished. And interestingly, also the role model micro-district in Bishkek was actually, in this sense, built by an urban planner with the name of Mira Hovhannisyan. About very few is known. And from this, these are like the three kind of, let's say, historical trajectories of urban utopia I looked at with regard to Central Asia. And the third one here is building the ecopolis in the hinterland that reconstruct the late Soviet utopian project of turning the science town of Pushino in the Moscow Oblast by a Kyrgyz philosopher and a Georgian biochemist into a sustainable ecopolis. These are all projects that refer to my already complemented research in Central Asia. And now from here, we move from the more historical research to that links it to the present. And here there's another research chapter I've completed in Bishkek, which ventures from the crisis-ridden present towards alternative horizons of the urban, something that will be important now for what I have in mind for Yerevan too. And this case study here, Flashes of Hope, reconstruct the case of a group of Bishkek activists who waged a legal battle to re-socialize and ultimately functionally restore the Soviet-era planetarium of the city, focusing on a group of activists in their 20s, all born a decade after the demise of the Soviet Union. It explores the potential and limits of reclaiming socialist materiality as an object accessible to the present-day public. And this is the leading idea that will connect me to what I have in mind with regard to Yerevan. What is my point of departure? The point of departure is the project of visualizing memory, which we conducted last year with participants in Yerevan. But what I'm planning to conduct now in my first project-related fieldwork in Yerevan, I'm blending in with previous research conducted on youth mobilization and socialist era materiality in Bishkek. That is the last project I've mentioned briefly on the Bishkek Planetarium. The envisaged research, I would likewise like to explore how Armenians born after the end of the USSR, that is generations that are younger than me, I'm also getting old, relate to the materiality and ideatic legacy of the socialist era Yerevan. So point of departure form author ethnographic insights from the Visualizing Memory project, that a sensory urban memory project implemented since 2019 in direct participation of the Berlin-based NGO Needed, and in collaboration with the Southern Caucasus office of the Heinrich Böll Foundation. You see here some insights from the workshop that we conducted over the last year. And as you see first the participants, which come from a wide range of different disciplines, from sociology over journalism and architecture to economy, and also people actually outside of the field of social science and humanities. So the first idea was a kind of contextualizing the city. We want people to have a chance to look at Yerevan. These are all, we talk about participants that are from Yerevan. We want them to get a fresh look on the city that they have been seeing their whole life. And based on this, we kind of like engage people we made familiarize them with the notion of deriv. I again will not go too much into detail because this is not something that is more relevant for the project than is for my own research project. But what was important again is to be able to reconnect to the place with which you are very familiar in a very unfamiliar way, to kind of see things that you're normally not used to see, because the things that you see every day are the things most invisible to you. And why we were doing this? The important, the kind of ultimate goal of these workshops was that the participants themselves deliberately create their own alternative city tours of Yerevan. So the idea is like we basically like introduced them to we gave them a different methodology to connect to the city. And our idea was like give us alternative city tours, something about Yerevan that people might not be familiar with. These are all, as I said, not people with an external perspective. These are all participants born and raised in Yerevan. And the interesting thing, and here it links back to my research, there's something very surprising, because we gave them also historical sessions where we talked about Persian Yerevan, we talked about present day Yerevan, we talked about the Yerevan in the late Tsarist period, in the Soviet period. Was the choice of the projects. From the 7 projects, 6 projects directly engaged with Soviet Yerevan, which we found very interesting because we gave, they were absolutely free to actually draft their own project. So we had no influence at all on the choice of the themes of the project. And the interesting thing is not only that they engaged with Soviet Yerevan, but that they engaged with Soviet Yerevan in a way that we actually did not expect. Because they expect, the interesting thing is here that we talk about participants that all are born after for the Soviet Union. But the interesting thing is that they engage with aspects of Soviet Yerevan that are all have something in common. That are all picturing a fragmented image of Yerevan, a Yerevan that remained unfulfilled, a Yerevan that somehow sets out towards a future horizon that it never reaches. So the interesting thing is that they all explore different aspects of Yerevan as an unfulfilled city. One is like that of the Yerevan Metro, which speaks to the unfinished future of urban connectivity, as it explores the unfinished socialist project of connectivity at the example of the Yerevan Metro, shedding light here on the interaction between metro station and its surrounding urban environment by the architectures der Mosesian. Another project by the journalist Karin Manoukian, the Architectress term, refers to the unfinished future of woman-shaped urbanity in Yerevan, as it explores the Soviet-era urban planning at the example of the Soviet-Armenian architect Anna Ter-Avetikian, author of buildings such as the cinematographer's residential building at the corner of Orient Street, or the Ministry of Trade and the David Sassoon-Sea Cinema Hall. And bring in another example, the cinematic Yerevan speaks here to the unfinished future of an open access public culture. That is, as it explores the unfinished socialist project of open access public culture at the example of Soviet-era cinema halls and their current afterlife. Also here, the delving into the complex process of re-evaluation, commodification, and irrevocable destruction. And ultimately, the last one that I chose, these were 6 that's directly engaged with the Soviet past. I will just confine here with 4. The last one is from a cinematographer, Diana Shahbazian. By the way, these are all we're talking about people that are basically most of them the age of early 20s, so 22, 23. So Parallel Yerevan here speaks to the unfinished future of workers Yerevan, and here it explores the unfinished socialist project of the workers' city and the afterlife of industrial Yerevan. The project centers around Kashigortsna Street, a quiet parallel street of Ashakunyat Street, and the environment consisting mainly of former factory workers and their families. So what I'm doing, or what I was doing, instead of participatory observations, what I have started is actually to conduct semi-structured interviews with the participants. I've mentioned intensive multi-session interviews, and of course, visual documentation. But what is the questions that I'm really interested in? It's something that I was already trying to hint at when I was already outlining the overarching goal of my larger research. But what is specifically interesting for me with regard to these alternative city tours? I think the first research theme, and as you see, these are like, of course, no clear-cut questions, these are still approximations to my research, is that of the pastime as a foreign land. That is, how do participants socialized after the end of the Soviet Union relate to the immaterial heritage of the socialist city? And here also, to which degree do material structures that have outlived the system to which they owe its existence continue to shape urban space, and not only urban space, but also the imaginary of the residents who live in the city? The other thing is, and that's, I think, maybe one of the most interesting questions, that is that of what kind of like, with what emotional mode do they relate to it, right? Is it like retrotopian romantic, like to use the wording of Sigmund Baumann, or is it more critical, curious way that poses the present, where the past poses the present into question, that is more in the vein of what Walter Benjamin has in mind in his historical thesis? So why do participants prefer to focus after all on the social city? I think that's the first most fundamental question in their alternative city tours. And are they driven there by a kind of retrotopian romanticization? Do they look for the past as a place for what is termed as Soviet nostalgia? Or is it critical curiosity? What do they really seek to unveil through their tours? Because again, the only thing that we gave to participants was the goal. These tours need to be bring in certain perspective of Yerevan that might be unaware, that people might be unaware, even people living in Yerevan. That was the only kind of framework that they had for formulating these tours. And which aspects of socialist era urbanity elicit their interests and why? And that, I think, links to the ultimate question, that is bygone futures and persisting presence. I think something that we will discuss very much in depth, I think, with the very last panel of this conference. And here I'm interested as to which present day causes do the materialization of the past here linked to. And I think that's something that we have already partially seen foreshadowing in some of the alternative city tours, but it's something that, of course, is still on a level of approximation. So we have here, for example, the visibility of women that seemed to be important to one of the participants in her in the choice of her tour to focus on the female architect Avetikia. We have the idea of urban connectivity. I think is an issue that I've seen is one of the most pressing issues in present-day Bishkek, and I assume that it's also something that plays a huge role in the current urban issues of Yerevan, but again, it's something that I will explore more in depth next year. And also the question of access to public culture, the idea of a non-commodifiable or not commodified public culture, and the question of social equality. This is something, these are kind of causes that are somehow rooted in the present, as it seems, but they take the form of being rediscovered in the past. And I think that is specifically something that seems to be very interesting. Again, this is the kind of point, only the point of departure for a larger research where I don't want to engage with the participants of this workshop, but where I want to engage with larger numbers of present-day residents of Yerevan born after the Soviet Union. And I want here to understand, to link it back to the initial point of departure, that is that of a cosmopolitan horizon. How do the urban futures of the past speak to a futureless present? And as humanity is entering here the age of the Urbanocene, in which the condition of the contemporary city becomes tantamount with the condition of humanity, we have to confess that the most present questions of modern housing indeed still remain to be solved. That is affordable quality housing for everyone, access to green spaces and social infrastructure, the democratization of urban decision-making, and the co-participation of residents in the shaping of a socially meaningful and sustainable future city. And in an effort to formulate response to these questions, this ongoing research project revisits the heterogeneous experience of socialist urbanity and specifically its specific material manifestations in the Southern Caucasus and Central Asia. However, not as an endpoint, not as a place to wallow in a Soviet nostalgia, but as a provisional point of departure to embark from it towards another and yet unrealized cosmopolitan horizon. Thanks a lot.